What happened when a single dad faced a CEO's demanding challenge? He answered with hands that had learned to keep people alive in the dark, and a quietness that never wanted to be seen. That night, the hospital smelled like bleach and old coffee. The gurney slammed into the emergency bay. Overhead lights peeled back the seams of a designer coat. A woman with a chipped manicure whispered, "Please make it fast." Ethan Ward moved without deciding. He wore an old security jacket, the kind that had seen too many night shifts and too little sleep. He had been a combat medic before a single father's life rerouted him into night rounds and the slow economy of the city. He slid between stretcher and door, hands steady. The world condensed to breath, pulse, the precise work of stopping the drift toward nothing. Short commands, quick checks, fingers pressing, bandaging, keeping airways open. A line of bright monitors flared. Dr. Reyes barked orders. Jenny handed instruments with a small, grateful smile. Ethan did the things the room needed, clipped a bleeding artery, adjusted an oxygen mask until the woman's chest rose cleanly, said the words no one else did because he had to, soft, matter-of-fact, practical. He didn't look for thanks. He couldn't. There was a child in a one-room apartment somewhere, homework waiting at a kitchen table. There was a promise made to a grave that had his wife's name on it. He worked as if efficiency could be an apology, as if competence could be a way to carry both the dead and the living. When the immediate danger passed and the machines found rhythm, Olivia Hart blinked in a haze of fluorescent light. Her breath tasted like metal. Her eyes found his, not the flashbulbs and suits she lived around, but a man with knuckles that had known worse weather. "Who?" she began. "Security," he said, plain, precise. He stepped back. That was where his name should have lived, unremarked, part of the hospital's night skin. But Olivia's life had a different architecture. Her days were framed by profiles and headlines. A single story could bend markets or mobilize charities. Her public relations team moved like the fingers of a pianist across sensitive keys. Marcus, who kept her calendar and her press releases, hovered with a practiced neutrality, eyes quick to measure consequence. No names, Olivia heard herself say later, softer than she intended. It was not cruelty so much as instinct. A rescue story could become a liability. Gratitude could be weaponized into expectation. She asked the hospital quietly, earnestly, keep the rescuer unnamed. Let the night go unused. Let no narrative bloom around a man who should remain ordinary. The hospital complied. Reports folded. Staff remembered the hands that steadied them, but filed the memory with other things. Shift notes, supply orders, the small, exhausted kindnesses of a midnight shift. Marcus chalked it up to good risk management. Olivia slept and woke to schedules and shareholder demands, and then, in the privacy of her single-bed hotel suite at dawn, a strange, tight remorse. Ethan went back to routine. He finished his rounds, checked doors, logged incidents into a battered clipboard, and walked home to Grace. Grace was 8, blunt with crayons and full of certainty. Her drawings knew no smallness. She drew heroes with capes and hands that held suns. On the wall of their kitchen, taped with careful strips of scotch, was a drawing of a tall figure with an enormous smile and a cape sewn out of stars. Above it, Grace had written in large, crooked letters, "Hero Dad." "Did you see?" she asked, the day after the rescue, as if the world could be condensed into a single question at breakfast. "See the sun?" Ethan riffed, pouring milk. He let the joke stand because it made her laugh, and he needed her laughter like she needed the next breath. He rearranged his shift schedule on his phone with a thumb and made a note about picking up extra hours the next weekend. Being a single dad had taught him to wrap decisions around small certainties. Homework, bedtime stories, the ritual of tucking Grace's hair behind her ear until the world felt contained. In the evenings, he practiced the practical lessons of his past. He showed Grace how to press a bandage into place on a torn toy, how to breathe through sharp fear. He hid the ragged edges of his grief in the way he made pancakes this one way she liked them, extra fluffy, browned just so. When she clambered into bed, he would kiss the top of her head, and she would press her small, warm hand into his chest and ask, always the same question, with the solemnity of a child who believed in pledges, "Will you always be my hero?" He would tell her, always. He meant it. Olivia's request for silence carried like a weight through the hospital corridors, but it did not change the way the city stirred. That weight settled briefly, then became something else, an unease Olivia tried to ignore. In boardrooms, the calculus was simple. Fame was messy. In private, her chest tightened when she thought of the security guard under the blue lights, hands working as if they belonged to someone else. It angered the part of her that had been taught to control outcomes. Weeks later, the hospital hosted a charity gala. The Heart Foundation, which Olivia had helped fund, gathered donors under chandeliers the color of champagne. The room sounded like careful wealth. Clinking glass, hushed auctions, photographs staged like still lifes. Olivia stood on a small stage and made a speech about responsibility, about the obligations of power. Her voice was smooth. Her eyes scanned the crowd for affirmation. Ethan was there because hospital events sometimes needed the quiet, reliable presence of night staff. He had been asked to do security for the evening, work he took in exchange for a little extra money, a little extra wiggle room to buy Grace new school shoes if winter came early. He stood by a service door in the same jacket, unnoticed against velvet and steel. Grace had been at home with a neighbor who watched cartoons and pretended the world outside didn't exist. The gala hummed and then splintered. A guest at the back, a man with thin skin and a crown of white hair, slumped without warning. Someone shouted. Glass fell. The room, trained in social moderation, staggered into panic. Olivia moved toward the edge of the stage, the speech dead on her tongue. Ethan was already there. He shed the part of him that lived in night checks and became the exact instrument the moment needed. He knelt in the polished aisle, found a pulse, set his jaw, and pulled the crowd back with a voice that had been trained to command under pressure. He worked like a person used to peeling people away from disaster, braced against the noise of suit and tie panic. Hands on sternum, tilt of head, mouth to mouth when the rhythm demanded it. It took time that felt like a lifetime. The ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Olivia watched him move, watched how his shoulders anchored a fragment of terror into order. She saw then the same hands she had glimpsed months before in a cold, humming ER. She felt a flush of something like shame at her prior insistence on silence. It settled into her like an ache. When the man regained a color that did not belong to a ghost, the room exhaled. Cameras found the stage again. People reached for phones. Someone in the crowd began to clap, a slow, hesitant drum. Olivia moved through it, toward the man on the floor and the security jacket kneeling at his side. She learned his name then, properly, Ethan Ward, and opened a drawer on herself she had been taught to keep locked. The PR instinct did not vanish. It warred with the more dangerous thing, responsibility. Marcus hovered, waiting for the directive. The board had always favored predictability. Now the story had chosen its own contours. Backstage, Olivia confronted a choice. She ordered a statement to be released about the evening's emergency, a simple note of gratitude to unnamed staff. It was the safer path. Then, looking at the footage from the floor and at a colleague who had scribbled "former combat medic" on a napkin and slid it across to her, she realized that anonymity would become an erasure of the man who had saved her and possibly others. The PR challenge had become a moral test. She found Ethan later, outside the ballroom, leaning against a brick wall with his jacket zipped to the chin. He was tired in a way money could not fix, sleepless, alert in the edges where people stop being polite and start being fragile. "You shouldn't be here," she said before she could stop herself. The sentence was less accusation than observation. "I should be where I am needed," he replied. He did not stay for praise. He did not posture. He had a child who needed pancakes. She asked him about his service. He answered with the economy of someone who had seen too much for small talk. He spoke of a wife who had been taken fast and a daughter who turned grief into drawings. She listened. Olivia did not make a spectacle of apologies. She did something harder. She reconciled the calculus of her position with the truth of what she had seen. That night, in front of her PR team, and in the quiet of a room that smelled faintly of perfume and lemon, she made a public decision. At the next press conference, she would name him. She would apologize for asking the hospital to let him be invisible. She would not give him coins for gratitude. She would offer him, instead, something that could be more useful than applause. The press conference was brisk and bright. Microphones gathered like curious insects. Olivia stood at the podium, her posture practiced. Cameras clicked the way waves break. She spoke of responsibility and people who do the hard things without fanfare. And she looked out of habit and intention, until her gaze found the living room of a family on a small television screen. Someone had turned the channel, and Ethan and Grace were watching from their couch, a bowl of popcorn between them. Grace's drawing, taped to their refrigerator, reflected like a small flag. "I was wrong to ask for silence," Olivia said into the microphones. The words were calibrated but honest. "The man who saved my life deserves his name spoken aloud." She read it then. Ethan Ward. The cameras turned like sunflowers. His name spilled into the feeds. For a man who had asked not to be seen, suddenly there were more eyes than his nights had ever known. The publicity found him at midday, at the small diner where he had a slice of pie and a coffee, wiping syrup from his fingers and thinking about Grace's spelling test the next day. Phones buzzed with offers and interviews. A producer wanted to know how it felt to be a hero. A local councilman wanted to honor him at a ceremony. A journalist wanted an exclusive. Ethan sat with the noise and let it hum around him like weather. He turned most of it down. Fame scares him. Charity that feels like pity makes him rigid. He wanted things that mattered in the gravity of his life. A steady paycheck, someone who could guarantee a school where Grace wouldn't be shifted to the margins, a way for his nights to mean something beyond one rescue. He wanted respect without spectacle, dinners without cameras, a life that allowed bedtime stories and soccer practices, not parades. Olivia, to her credit, heard the fine print of his refusals. She returned with an offer that was careful and practical. The Heart Foundation needed someone with his experience, an advisor who could shape community outreach, a front for a program that would marry medical care to veteran support and family services. It would be part-time. They would work around Grace's schedule. It would pay what mattered and commit to more than photos. She offered him a place where his skills mattered beyond the immediacy of an emergency. "It can't be all publicity," he said when she outlined the role. "My daughter, she needs me at night. She needs routine. I can teach a class, run training drills, sit on a board sometimes, but I won't be a face for your ads." She listened. What she had imagined at first, an endorsement, a speech, a neat narrative, eased into something that required real compromise. Power meant having the ability to make things right. That afternoon, she promised her PR team two things: to stop shaping him into a soundbite, and to fund a space that would bear his name only if it served the work he believed in. When Ethan accepted, it was because the offer solved a problem he lived with every day: how to keep Grace safe and whole. He imagined a room where kids could get quick care, where veterans could talk to someone who understood the specific language of trauma, where a nurse could sit and listen without pressure. He imagined Grace someday teaching another child how to breathe through it. The job offered tools to build that world. He took it, for her. Work began in small shifts. Ethan taught first aid classes for volunteers. He helped design a training curriculum for community responders. He met with Dr. Reyes and with Jenny, who now had an extra reason to smile when she saw him. His competence translated differently in daylight. He wrote memos, he listened on panels, he was patient in rooms where people spoke in the antiseptic language of grants and budgets. He learned to use corporate language without losing the clarity of his hands. Olivia learned to listen without filtering everything through shareholder implications. Outside work, life settled into a pattern that felt like a seam stitched gently into a larger cloth. Grace kept drawing. The superhero image reappeared in different forms, now with a patch on the costume labeled Ward Center in blocky letters. Ethan, who avoided gifts and speeches, allowed himself small moments of pride. A letter from a parent thanking him for a workshop, a volunteer who said his training had helped them keep someone alive. Olivia's armor softened in ways that were careful and credible. She trusted him to tell her when a program's publicity bordered on exploitation. She learned to put her name behind goods that did work rather than attention. Sometimes she would catch herself in the mirror, and the reflection would be notched with a new private standard. The board noticed the bottom line improved. The foundation got better stories. Not the glamour of a gala, but the quiet ones of a child who learned how to press a dressing, a veteran who found a counselor who'd been awake at night, too. Small moments accumulated into a relationship that resisted the lines people wanted to draw. On a Wednesday morning, when the clinic needed volunteers, Olivia arrived with coffee. No PR person, no cameras, just a tall cup and an uneasy grin. Grace came with a drawing she wanted Olivia to see. Olivia leans down and took the paper, smoothing it between careful fingers. "Be brave, little healer," someone had scrawled on the edge, a phrase that fit like a charm. "That was my idea," Olivia said, as if the admission cost her nothing and everything at once. She found herself offering a small silver bracelet later, an impulsive, awkward pronouncement of tenderness she hadn't known she could make. "For Grace," she said, handing it over. "Not because of anything I did, because you two hold this together." The bracelet had an engraving Ethan had seen before in the quiet of an army hospital, words that held duty and softness. He slipped it gently onto Grace's wrist in the back seat of a pickup truck, and the city slid by. Cold streetlights, steam rising from grates, the small domestic universe humming. They built the Ward Center on a foundation of choices that could sustain. It was more than a plaque or a ribbon. It was a design honed by people who had sat with suffering and known they wanted a different answer. The center offered evening medical triage, an on-call counselor who specialized in trauma, job placement services for veterans, and workshops for parents on basic emergency care. There was a small room with crayons and a low table where children could draw without the adult world peeking in. Ethan insisted that the doors be wide and that appointment slots be flexible for people who worked nights. Building it was ugly in ways that polite narratives rarely tell. Meetings that stretched into dinners, grant proposals rewritten until they sounded like poems, arguments about signage, budget numbers that had to be pressed and coaxed into reality. Olivia tracked every cost with a calculator and then measured them against a ledger of humane outcomes. Marcus, who had once filed pain away like a weather report, now learned to keep a notebook with names and follow-ups. Jenny took shifts at the new clinic and joked that the supply closet smelled better than most donors' basements. At the ribbon cutting, there was a crowd that mixed comfortable donors and people who had slept in shelters, veterans in camouflage jackets and nurses with tired eyes, local station reporters and neighbors who had never expected to see a building speak to their needs. Olivia gave a speech that managed to be both corporate and honest. She spoke of responsibility and of the man who had refused to let his life be a headline. She paused, and the cameras leaned in. "Ethan Ward taught us what it looks like to be brave without broadcast," she said, "to be a force for others when there is no camera in the corner. Today, we try to honor that by building something that does the work after the applause ends." Then, in a moment that surprised none of the people who had watched them quietly rebuild one another, she pinned a small medal on Ethan's jacket. The medal was not gaudy. It was a simple disc that read, "Community Service, Ward Center." It was a symbol of thanks, but more importantly, it was a public, deliberate refusal to let the man's name disappear into anonymity again. Ethan's face held a private map of years, losses, training, quiet nights. He accepted the medal the way he took a patient's hand in a sterile room, with recognition, with more attention than performance. Grace bolted up in the first row, beaming as if the ribbon had been cut for her alone. After the ceremony, people clustered for photographs. Olivia stayed for a while, less on brand and more human than anyone had expected. She held a cup of coffee and watched Ethan with a look that had softened through effort. They had not become friends in the facile sense. They had become people who could look at each other's scars and know what a scar meant. Work at the center evolved. It absorbed small victories and the steady drag of reality. There were patients who walked in and found the help they needed, and others who came back weeks later with small, hard-won improvements. There were nights when Ethan did rounds to check on volunteers, and nights when a veteran sat with him in silence for an hour and left with a phone number for a counselor. Occasionally, the press would come by and ask for another human interest piece, flames of feel-good that elided the slow, important work. Ethan refused most of those. Olivia learned to accept that their impact could be quiet. Not every day was a triumph. There were arguments about the use of funds, a donor who wanted to name a wing after himself, a bureaucrat who delayed a license. Some nights the clinic's lights burned long into the small hours, and Ethan sat in a chair with his jacket over his shoulders, thinking about how many people slept rough in winter. But little by little, the center stitched itself to the neighborhood. People told their friends about a place where someone listened. Grace, who had once drawn a cape and declared her father a hero, found herself leading a small workshop about how to help at home for elementary students. She read aloud, stammering, proud, the instructions Ethan wrote in plain language, and parents applauded like it was a new sort of sermon. The trio, Ethan, Grace, Olivia, kept meeting in modest human moments. Olivia finally knew the taste of pancakes made the way Grace liked them, and Ethan discovered a fondness for late-night coffee conversations where language could be stripped down to what mattered. They argued sometimes, over funding, over boundaries, over the way security was managed in a clinic that wanted to feel safe but not militarized. Their disagreements were honest and necessary. They kept the center from becoming a monument to ego. There was a day, some months after the center opened, when a reporter asked Ethan if he felt grateful for the attention he had received. The question was small and dangerous. Gratitude could be the beginning of a play in which the rescued became props. Ethan considered the microphone and the light and thought of Grace at home, coloring the Ward Center banner with markers that bled at the edges. "I'm grateful it helps people," he said, using the exactness of someone who had learned to speak in useful phrases. "I'm grateful my daughter's school won't have to move us again. But I'm not grateful for fame. I'm grateful for the work we get to do." Olivia, watching from the side, felt the warmth of relief. The demanding challenge she had presented, asking for silence to control narrative, had forced her to examine her own instincts towards control. When she had chosen to name him, to admit mistake, she had invited the public into a more mature story, accountability and restitution instead of convenient gratitude. It had cost her reputation in the short term. It had bought something lonelier and truer in the long run: alignment. At night, when the clinic's lights dimmed and the city cooled, Ethan and Grace would sit by their small kitchen table and count the small riches of ordinary life. Grace would bring out a new drawing, this one a wide sunrise, and tape it over the old hero dad sketch. "We found the sun," she would declare, with the certainty only a child can muster. Once, in the early dawn, the three of them, Ethan, Grace, and Olivia, walked the perimeter of the center. The sky had the fragile blue of a day unwilling to make big promises, but determined to try. Olivia paused at a window where children had drawn crayon suns and took a breath that did not sound like a press release. "I used to think making a difference meant writing checks," she said. Her voice was private. "I didn't know the cost of letting someone be invisible." Ethan smiled then, in a way that held no triumph. He had learned to accept offers on his terms and to keep his daughter's life the axis of his choices. "You did the right thing," he said. "Not because you apologized, but because you stayed after. That's what fixes things." They stood there under the gray that was becoming light, a small community made out of deliberate decisions rather than accident. It was, by no means, the end of anything. There would be more challenges, states of emergency that required hands like Ethan's and decisions like Olivia's. But in that moment, they had assembled a foundation that might weather the storms. At the grand opening, after speeches and ribbon cutting and a chorus of people thanking each other, Olivia took Ethan aside. Her hands trembled, slight as a ledger. She conferred a small, private gratitude that the cameras could not quite capture. "Don't be easy to hide anymore," she said, not as an order, but as a plea. "Let people know your name when it matters. Let them see you before they need you." Ethan thought of Grace asleep that night, of a future with predictable breakfasts and school plays and the occasional storm. He thought of the man he had been in uniform, the wife he had loved and lost, and the quiet dignity of the job he had done in hallways and ballrooms. He nodded once, the motion small and full of meaning. "I won't disappear," he promised. "Not into the background we've been taught to accept. Not when there are more hands to train and more kids who need to know what to do." Years later, photographs of the Ward Center would show a plaque and a folding ribbon. They would show a woman who had once tried to manage narrative and a man who had once preferred anonymity, now standing together with a child between them. They would show volunteers and nurses, a small garden behind the building planted with the hands of community members who had learned the hard thing of tending. None of it was perfect. There were days when funds wavered and nights when a counselor had one too many heavy cases to take home. There were still arguments, sometimes sharp, sometimes tender, over how to keep the center open without making it a spectacle. But the story had changed from one of transactional gratitude to one of sustained duty. The center's work trickled into the neighborhood like a slow, steady tide. A veteran who found mental health support and then volunteered at the front desk. A teenager who learned compression after watching a class and later saved a friend from choking. Dozens of small ripples that didn't look dramatic in headlines, but whose sum mattered. On a morning years later, when the sun came up like a promise kept, and Grace was taller, with a backpack and an adult's habit of waking early, Ethan and Olivia stood together at the center's garden. Olivia handed him a simple rectangle of metal, a community honor they had designed together. She pinned it to his jacket with careful fingers. "Ethan Ward," she said, voice steady now with a history between them, "for service that carried our city when it needed carrying." Grace snapped a family photo on someone's old phone. The light caught the silver bracelet Olivia had given her years before, and the day's gold found all of them. It was not a fairy tale. It was not a story that fixed everything. It was, instead, the accurate account of what can happen when a single father's hands refuse to be erased, and a CEO's ambition turns toward responsibility rather than control. What happened, in the end, was a change that began with a demand for silence and returned as a demand for accountability. The CEO's challenge was not simply an edict issued in a moment of risk avoidance. It was a moral test that forced choice. When the choice was made for naming rather than disowning, for building rather than praising, the city gained something small and essential. A place that listened when people were afraid, a mentor who taught how to keep someone alive, and a child who learned that heroes can be ordinary people who come home every night. If this story has moved you, if you believe small acts change the world, subscribe and stay with stories that honor quiet courage. The Ward Center kept its doors open. People came with scraped knees and heavier things. They were met with hands that knew how to steady and a welcome that didn't ask for applause. The morning light settled over them, while Grace, now taller and less tentative, led a volunteer in a simple drill. Ethan watched, not conspicuous, not seeking praise, proud in the way a father is proud that is quieter than triumph. At the very end, after the speeches and the cameras and the steady life settled back into its rhythms, Olivia stood apart for a moment and looked at the sunrise. She had learned that wealth could be a force for repair when wielded without hunger for credit. She had learned how much courage it took to admit a mistake publicly and to do the hard bookkeeping of restitution. Ethan, Grace, and Olivia walked out into the new day together. The camera hovered at a distance, the kind of shot that is long on warmth and short on show, and caught the three of them in the pale gold. A man who had been summoned by crisis and had chosen family first. A child who kept drawing capes because she believed in the shape of bravery, and a woman who had been tested and changed by the weight of her choices. There would be more emergencies. There would be more nights when Ethan's hands had to become a life raft. There would be more announcements and board meetings, and Marcus would still write notes like a man who had learned to care. But for now, the ward center hummed with ongoing work. The medal on Ethan's jacket was a quiet promise pinned in public, a reminder that naming the good we see is the first step toward making it endure. If this story touched you, consider supporting community healthcare in your area or learning more about centers like the Ward Center, real places that need steady resources more than short-lived headlines. Share this with someone who believes in honoring quiet courage.